The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical prayer above Mercy General, a sound most people stopped hearing after their first week. Natalie Hayes heard it every morning at 5:13 a.m., the exact moment she pushed through the emergency department's back entrance, before the day staff arrived, before the chaos had a name. She moved through the corridors like water through a sieve, present but unnoticed, necessary but invisible. Her scrubs were navy blue, regulation standard, the kind that didn't catch light or draw eyes. That was deliberate. 20 years. 20 years of this particular brand of erasure, though the first 12 had been earned under different uniforms in different deserts. The difference was that in Kandahar, people noticed you. In Kandahar, they knew your name. In Kandahar, when you moved, people paid attention. Here at Mercy General in San Diego, Natalie Hayes was a single note in a symphony nobody was listening to anymore. She clocked in at 5:52 a.m. and walked to the staff locker room, her left leg compensating for an old fracture that had healed slightly wrong on purpose, easier to blend in if you moved like someone who'd never seen real violence. The locker room smelled of stale coffee and the ghost of last night's antiseptic mopping. She opened locker 237, the one she'd occupied for 18 years, and pulled out her ID badge. Just the name. Just the credentials. Nothing that said Senior Chief Petty Officer. Nothing that said Navy Cross, tucked away in a storage unit across town, visited once a year in darkness like visiting a grave. The unit patch was still there, sewn inside her scrub jacket lining against her ribs. Faded. Barely visible. A thin line of stitching holding 20 years of secrets against her chest like a second heartbeat. She ran her thumb across it, a habit, a ritual, a prayer, then pulled the jacket on and fastened the front buttons. The patch disappeared under the fabric. Good. The shift change meeting started at 6:15 a.m. in Conference Room B, the one with the broken coffee maker and the window that looked out onto the parking lot where the sun hadn't yet decided whether to rise. Natalie sat in the back corner, the way she always did, her hands wrapped around a cup of lukewarm coffee. The cup was white, stamped with the hospital logo, anonymous as everything else about her. When the night shift supervisor mentioned a complicated admission coming up at 7, Natalie's hands trembled slightly, just once, a barely perceptible movement from someone trained to suppress the autonomic response. Muscle memory. Stress. The body remembering things the mind was supposed to have forgotten. Dr. Michael Hargrove walked in at 6:19 a.m., 4 minutes late, which meant it was on purpose. He wore his white coat like armor, pressed, pristine, with his name embroidered in script on the left chest, Dr. Michael Hargrove, M.D., Trauma Surgery. The residents trailed behind him like ducklings following the mother duck, 3 of them this month, all eager and polished and hungry to please the man who held their recommendations in his hands. He was 62 years old, silver-haired, the kind of handsome that had translated into board connections and hospital politics and the kind of power that didn't require him to raise his voice. He scanned the room with the casual assessment of a man accustomed to ownership. His eyes moved across the assembled nurses, the residents, the attending physicians, and then they stopped. On Natalie. Just for a moment. A fraction of a second longer than neutral. She felt it the way animals feel a shift in air pressure before a storm rolls in. She didn't look up from her coffee. She kept her eyes on the white cup, on the hospital logo, on the safe geography of things that couldn't see her. Hargrove settled into a seat near the front, crossed his legs with deliberate precision, and began discussing the incoming cases. His voice was deep, controlled, the kind of voice that had learned to make commands sound like gentle suggestions. "We're going to be busy today," he said, and nobody in that room thought to doubt him. "The EMS network is funneling everything through us. I want to see sharp work, focused execution. No room for dead weight in trauma." He let that phrase hang in the air. Dead weight. His eyes found Natalie again, still in the back corner, still wrapped around her anonymous white cup. She could feel the other nurses glancing at her, the quick sideways looks that said they understood. They were good people, most of them. They felt bad about the dead weight comment. They would go about their day feeling slightly guilty but mostly grateful it wasn't them he was talking about. That was how institutional bullying worked. it created a comfortable consensus, a silent agreement that yes, some people were worth more than others, and everyone who wasn't the target got to experience the relief of not being chosen. Natalie set down her cup with meticulous care, the rim aligned with the edge of the table, and stood. The meeting wasn't over, but she had rooms to check, supplies to restock, the invisible work that nobody thanked you for but everyone expected you to have done. As she moved toward the door, Hargrove's voice followed her, effortless and conversational. "Hayes, a word." She turned. The room went quiet. The fluorescent lights hummed their indifferent prayer. "Yes, doctor." The charting on the Morrison patient yesterday. "Sloppy. More careful next time." He was looking at papers on the desk in front of him, not at her, which meant he wasn't actually talking about the Morrison patient. He was performing. He was establishing hierarchy in front of his residents, showing them what he expected from people like her. "I'll review it. See that you do." She left before he could find something else to critique, moving through the corridor with the practiced invisibility that had kept her alive in 3 continents. The emergency department doors slid open as she approached, responsive to her presence even when nothing else was. The smell of antiseptic hit her, a sharp, clean, the chemical ghost of order imposed on chaos. She breathed it in. It reminded her of forward surgical teams. It reminded her of hands saving lives in the dark. That afternoon, during her break, Natalie drove across San Diego to a self-storage facility in El Cajon, the kind of place where people kept the things they couldn't bear to look at regularly but couldn't quite throw away. Her unit was number 47, up 3 flights of concrete stairs that echoed with each footfall. The key was small, brass, nondescript. She turned it in the lock and pushed open the metal door. Inside was a single cardboard box, sealed with packing tape, sitting on a folding table in the darkness. She pulled the chain on the overhead light, and a single bulb flickered to life, casting everything in sepia tones like a photograph of something already dead. Her hands were steady now. They were always steady here. She opened the box with careful deliberation, the tape peeling away like old skin, and lifted out the Navy Cross. It was smaller than people thought, the medal itself barely 2 inches across, suspended from its dark blue ribbon. The metal was scratched, worn, the finish dulled from 18 years in darkness and 1 month per year pulled into fluorescent light to be looked at and then put away again. On the back, her name was engraved, Natalie Hayes, Senior Chief Petty Officer, United States Navy. Below that, a date. September 14, 2004. Kandahar Province. She held it in her palm, not closing her fingers around it, just letting it rest there like something alive that might flee if she held too tight. The weight of it was nothing. 2.5 ounces maybe. The weight of what it represented was something else entirely. The memory came unbidden, the way they always did when she was alone. A school building in Kandahar, 3 stories, made of cheap concrete and rebar. An IED strike, the explosion unfolding in slow motion the way explosions did when you were trained to watch for them. Dust rising like a curtain. Voices screaming in Pashto. And somewhere beneath the rubble, a child crying. She remembered moving toward the sound while others moved away from it, her hands knowing what to do before her mind caught up. The child was a boy, maybe 6 years old, small enough that she could cradle him against her chest with one arm while pulling debris away with the other. A birthmark on his neck, dark and distinctive, shaped vaguely like a star. She remembered that mark clearly. She remembered thinking it made him look like something sacred. She'd pulled him into the light. His name was Marcus. He'd been crying, dust in his eyes, a cut along his ribs that would need stitches. She'd carried him toward the medical tents, her body shielding his, her hand steady on the back of his head. The Navy Cross came later, though at the time it had felt like a mistake. She'd only done what any person would do. Pull a child from the rubble. That was basic humanity, not valor. That was the kind of thing you didn't need a medal for. Now, 18 years later, holding that medal in the darkness of a storage unit in El Cajon, Natalie understood that nobody cared what you thought you deserved. They gave you medals or they didn't. They recognized you or they didn't. And if you were smart, if you'd spent enough time in places where recognition could kill you, you learned to live without it. She placed the medal back in the box, careful as a parent settling a sleeping child. The packing tape went back across the seal, her hands making clean, precise folds. The fluorescent light flickered above her, threatening to go out. She turned it off before it could, leaving herself in darkness, leaving the medal in darkness, leaving everything that had ever meant anything about her in darkness. Back in her car, driving through San Diego traffic, her hands were steady on the wheel. The coffee shop radio was playing something she didn't recognize, the kind of music designed to be background to other people's lives. She thought about the boy from Kandahar, Marcus, wondered what kind of man he'd become, whether that birthmark had faded with age, whether he remembered the woman who'd pulled him from the rubble in the dust and heat of a September afternoon in 2004. Probably not. That was good. That was the whole point of what she'd done with her life, become the kind of person who saved you and then vanished, left no mark, created no expectation. Just a nurse. Just someone in navy blue scrubs moving quietly through Mercy General, arriving early and leaving late, never complaining, never asking for recognition, never letting anyone see the Navy Cross that lived in darkness across the city. She pulled into the hospital parking lot at 4:41 p.m., 20 minutes before her evening shift started, and sat in her car for a moment with the engine off. The sun was beginning its descent toward the Pacific, painting the sky the color of old rust. She touched the unit patch sewn inside her jacket, feeling its shape through the fabric, confirming it was still there, still keeping her secrets, still holding her history against her ribs like a second heartbeat. Then she got out of the car and walked back through the sliding doors into Mercy General, where nobody knew who she was, where Dr. Hargrove had already decided she was dead weight, where the fluorescent lights hummed their indifferent prayer above the nurse's station, where she would spend the next 12 hours saving lives that the hospital would never credit to her name. Monday morning at 7 o'clock, 20 people crowded into the Mercy General conference room, coffee cups steaming on the table like an offering to the fluorescent gods above. Dr. Hargrove sat at the head of the mahogany table, leaning back in his chair with the confidence of a man who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. He was reviewing what he called retention metrics, a euphemism for how quickly he could break people who threatened the careful hierarchy he'd spent 32 years constructing. The residents flanked him like courtiers, their white coats still crisp from the laundry, their eyes hungry for approval from a man who controlled their futures with a single phone call to a fellowship program director. Natalie stood at the back near the coffee station, her navy scrubs already stained with the morning's first patient's blood work, her badge hanging at an angle that made her shoulders seem smaller than they were. She had been at Mercy General for 11 weeks. Nobody knew her. This was intentional. "I've been reviewing our nursing staff concerns," Hargrove said, his voice smooth as oil spreading across still water. His eyes traveled the room, performing consultation, performing leadership. Then they found her. "Our night shift transition hasn't been seamless. Some people simply aren't built for the pressure of trauma centers. Some lack the stamina." He paused, letting silence do the work. "In fact, I'll make a public wager. Our newest transplant from nights won't last a week on days. Any takers?" His smile was a knife wrapped in silk. The residents laughed. Not all of them, but enough. The senior nurses exchanged glances, pity mixed with relief that they weren't the target. Natalie took one measured breath. The kind of breath taught in combat medicine when you have 90 seconds to stop bleeding before shock becomes irreversible. Felt a single tear threaten at the corner of her eye. Did not blink. Did not look away. Met his gaze with the flat calm of someone who had already survived the worst that human beings could orchestrate, and said with devastating precision, "I've survived longer deployments than a week, doctor." The room went quiet in that specific way that happens when someone has misheard as insubordination something that was simply true. Hargrove's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, not because he understood what she meant, but because she hadn't flinched, hadn't apologized, hadn't looked away first. He interpreted the word deployments as assignments, a small mistake that cost him nothing, and he recovered. "Well then. Let's see if you have the Constitution." He turned back to his slides. The meeting continued. She had just made an enemy of a man with 3 board members on speed dial. The tea in her hand shook just slightly as she poured it at the station. Not fear. Anger. The kind that needed no outlet because it had nowhere to go. Thursday, 12:53 p.m. Cafeteria. Natalie carried her lunch tray past the resident's table, salad, water, a cup of soup in a plastic bowl. The kitchen was loud with the sound of 100 conversations layered over the clatter of spoons and the hiss of the industrial dishwasher somewhere behind the stainless steel counter. Hargrove sat with 6 residents around him, his shirt sleeves rolled up to the elbows, performing casualness the way only powerful people could. He extended his leg just slightly as she passed. Not enough to be obvious. Just enough. Her tray clattered to the floor. Soup exploded across the tile like a crime scene, vegetables scattering, the plastic bowl clattering with a sound like a gunshot in a hospital hallway. 3 residents erupted in laughter, the sharp, bright laughter of people who knew they had permission. 1 looked away, ashamed. 1 didn't look at all. "Careful there, Nightingale," Hargrove said, his voice loud enough to carry 3 tables over. "Maybe days aren't for everyone." Natalie knelt without comment. The floor was cold through the fabric of her scrubs. She picked up the bowl, piece by piece, using her bare hands because there was no time to find paper towels and she could hear the kitchen staff watching, could feel the weight of every eye in the cafeteria. 1 tear escaped down her cheek, not because of humiliation, but because she was thinking about a 6-year-old boy in Kandahar whose only meal that day might have been the crackers she'd given him from her own pack, and how his hands had shaken when he ate them. She wiped the tear without breaking eye contact with Hargrove, without flinching, without anything that would give him the satisfaction. She stood, bowl in hand, and said quietly enough that only he could hear, "I've cleaned up worse messes, doctor. Much worse." She walked to the trash, disposed of the ruined lunch, and clocked back in without eating. Her stomach could wait. She had been trained for this. The body was information. The hunger meant nothing. Friday afternoon, nurse's station, 3 p.m., the shift change window when the patient-to-staff ratio meant nobody was really watching anything but their own charts. Hargrove appeared from the hallway holding a patient file, and Natalie was filling out a 12-lead EKG documentation when she heard the sound before she saw what happened. The chart hit the floor like a verdict, paper scattering across the tile in a perfect explosion of his contempt. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, his voice the temperature of a surgical theater. "Let's see if you're good for something." The nurse's station went silent. Not the silence of surprise. The silence of witnessing. Of documentation happening in real time. Natalie set down her pen. The click was audible. She bent slowly, feeling the attention of 6 nurses, 2 resident physicians, an intern, and 1 attending who suddenly became very interested in his computer screen. She gathered each sheet with precise movements, the same movement she had used to gather wounded, to gather evidence, to gather the pieces of people who had stopped fitting together the way they were supposed to. 1 page had folded under the desk. She retrieved it. Another had slid under the medication cart. She got that one too. She assembled them in order, tapped the edges on the desk to align them perfectly, and handed them back to him with an expression as empty as a hospital waiting room at 3 in the morning. "I've picked up heavier things than your paperwork, doctor." His jaw tightened. Something moved behind his eyes, in not anger, but the faster cousin of anger. Recognition. She was not breaking the way he had calculated. The wager, the humiliation, the public performance, none of it was working because she was refusing to play the role of victim. She was playing the role of someone who had seen worse and would endure worse, and that refusal was more insubordinate than any argument could ever be. He watched her turn and walk back to her station, back to her charts, back to the patient who had coded 15 minutes ago and come back breathing. Back to the work of saving lives that nobody would credit to her name. He pulled out his phone before he had even returned to his office. By Friday evening, Hargrove was making calls. His office door closed, blinds drawn, phone pressed to his ear with the intensity of a man conducting a war. "Yes, I need you to pull her nursing school disciplinary records," he said to someone who apparently had authority over things that should have been private. I don't care about privacy protocols. You owe me from the board vote last spring. Pause. Her name is Hayes. Hayes, Natalie. I need to know if there's any history of insubordination. Scope of practice violations. Anything. He hung up, scrolled through his phone contacts, and dialed again. A man who had learned long ago that institutional power was not about being the smartest in the room, it was about being connected to the people who made decisions when nobody was looking. The next call went to someone who picked up on the second ring and addressed him by his first name. I'm requesting an external investigator to review personnel files. Specifically Hayes, Natalie. Nursing staff. I have concerns about her conduct, her training, her fundamental fitness for this hospital's standards. A pause. No, I can't be more specific yet. That's why we need the investigator. He smiled as he listened to the agreement on the other end. The machinery was turning now. Slow, inevitable, shaped by decades of investment in the right people. Friday evening at 4 p.m., he sent an email to the hospital administrator marked Confidential, Personnel Matter. I have observed concerning patterns in our new nursing staff that suggest possible scope of practice overreach and insubordination toward attending physicians. These patterns warrant administrative review. I am available to discuss specifics at your convenience. No details. No specifics. Just enough to plant the seed that would grow into an investigation. By Saturday morning, he had scheduled a meeting with 3 board members. All friends from medical school. All men who had been impressed by him 30 years ago and had never revised that assessment. He called each one personally, described Natalie as someone who was excellent technically but concerning philosophically, and mentioned his concern about the nursing staff developing delusions about their scope of practice. None of them asked for details. They didn't need to. They had learned, like Hargrove, that institutional power was about having allies who believed you first and asked questions never. The room waited. Mercy General's emergency bay doors did not open until 2:44 p.m. on Saturday afternoon, but the machinery was already moving. The machinery was already moving. Saturday morning, 6:08 a.m., Hargrove's office door closed with the soft click of institutional power locking into place. His hand trembled as he lifted the phone, not from fear but from the pure electrical charge of righteous vindication. He had her now. The pericardiocentesis had crossed a line that no nursing board could ignore. He dialed the San Diego Nursing Academy, voice steady and measured when the administrator answered on the third ring. This is Dr. Marcus Hargrove from Mercy General. I need Natalie Hayes' complete disciplinary history. Every notation. Every complaint. Everything. And I need it today. The demand was wrapped in administrative courtesy, the kind of politeness that made it sound like a request while being absolutely unmistakable as a command. His network went back 30 years. One call and doors opened. The academy director's voice changed on the other end of the line, deferential, suddenly aware that this was not a routine inquiry but a professional takedown in motion. He hung up and waited exactly 90 seconds before making the second call. His fingers moved across the keyboard with the precision of a surgeon, no, the precision of a man who had spent 2 decades learning exactly which buttons opened which doors. The outside investigator was a former hospital administrator named Pierce, the kind of man who made his living finding irregularities that were sometimes real and sometimes manufactured, depending on who was paying. Hargrove had paid for 2 separate investigations before. Pierce answered on the first ring. They had an understanding. Marcus. Good to hear from you. Pierce's voice carried the smooth confidence of a man who had never been held accountable for anything in his life. I need a full employment review. Natalie Hayes, Mercy General, registered nurse. Everything. Performance metrics, peer complaints, protocol deviations, medication errors, patient outcomes. Anything that shows a pattern of insubordination or medical overreach. Hargrove was careful with his language here. Not accusation. Documentation. Not vendetta. Due diligence. She performed a procedure yesterday that was outside her scope. I need evidence that this is part of a pattern. How fast? Pierce asked. Monday morning. That's rush work, Marcus. I'm aware. Hargrove was already mentally transferring the funds. Money moved faster than truth at Mercy General. It always had. Full investigation. Anything questionable gets flagged. Pierce agreed with the kind of enthusiasm that came from a $5,000 retainer hitting his account by close of business. The call lasted 43 seconds. Efficient. Surgical. Hargrove felt his shoulders drop an inch as the weight of institutional machinery began to turn. But that wasn't the worst part for Natalie. The worst part was waiting for him to finish. Hargrove opened his laptop and began typing. The email was a masterpiece of calculated professionalism, each word chosen to sound concerned rather than malicious. Subject line, request for personnel file review, professional standards concern. He copied it to 3 board members, the chief nursing officer, and the hospital administrator, ensuring that by the time Natalie arrived for her shift on Monday, her name would already be circulating in the places where careers went to die. To the San Diego Nursing Academy, he wrote, I am requesting a complete review of all disciplinary records, complaints, and performance evaluations for Ms. Natalie Hayes, RN, class of 2004. This inquiry is related to a patient safety concern at our facility. Any information regarding scope violations, medication errors, or pattern behavioral issues would be appreciated. This is a professional courtesy inquiry. Thank you for your prompt attention. Professional courtesy. The phrase was a knife disguised as a handshake. By Sunday afternoon, every institution she had ever worked for would be receiving similar requests. By Monday morning, her name would be flagged in 3 separate databases. The machinery did not move quickly in healthcare, it moved with the grinding inevitability of institutional weight, crushing anything underneath with the force of bureaucratic momentum. Hargrove set the email to send at 8:08 p.m. Saturday night, timing it so it would hit inboxes after business hours, giving people the whole evening to dwell on it. He had learned this trick from watching other doctors destroy their enemies. You didn't announce the takedown. You let the information seep out, contaminating the waters gradually, so by the time the person realized what was happening, everyone was already predisposed to believe the worst. His third call came at 7:15 a.m. This one was personal. Board member Richard Bancroft, the kind of man whose family name appeared on hospital wings and city park benches. Hargrove had written a favorable reference letter for Bancroft's son 5 years ago, the kind of favor that accumulated like compound interest. Richard, I need a favor. One of my staff nurses overstepped her authority yesterday. Performed a procedure she's not qualified for. I'm concerned about a pattern of boundary violations. Hargrove's voice was the voice of a concerned physician, not a vengeful one. This distinction mattered. I've initiated an outside review, but I wanted to make sure this was on the radar for the credential committee. She's been here a long time, very quiet, but I'm starting to think that's been masking something more serious. Bancroft listened without interrupting. He was old money, old power, the kind of institutional weight that didn't need to raise its voice. When he finally spoke, his voice was smooth as oil over still water. I'll have a conversation with the chief of staff. Consider it handled. And it was. By Monday morning, when Natalie arrived for her shift, the foundation of her anonymity had been methodically dismantled. Not through shouting or confrontation, but through the quiet machinery of institutional power that Hargrove had spent 30 years learning to operate. He had moved from public humiliation to strategic sabotage in exactly 72 hours. The documentation was building. Hospital records from 15 years ago, a medication count that was off by a single unit, flagged but ultimately resolved. A patient complaint from 2018 about pain management, investigated and cleared, but now pulled from archives and re-examined for new meaning. An old incident report where she had questioned a physician's dosing, filed without malice, now reframed as evidence of insubordination. Each item was small. None of them alone proved anything. Together, they created a portrait of someone who had been quietly dangerous all along, a wolf in nurse's clothing. Hargrove sat at his desk Saturday evening, watching the email queue, watching each message send, watching the institutional machinery begin its work. The outside investigator had already sent the first batch of preliminary findings, nothing damaging yet, but the promise was there, the implication that if you looked hard enough at any career, you could find something that looked wrong when the light hit it sideways. He had learned this from 30 years of board meetings and credential reviews and the quiet conversations that happened in country clubs where people like him decided the fates of people like her. Power wasn't about being right. It was about having the infrastructure to make people believe you were right. And his infrastructure was formidable. Outside his office window, San Diego's Saturday morning traffic moved slowly through the streets below. Somewhere in the hospital, Natalie Hayes was likely going about her weekend, unaware that the ground beneath her feet had just begun to shift. By Monday, she wouldn't recognize her own career. By Wednesday, she would be gone. And by the following month, she would be a name in a file, a cautionary tale whispered in break rooms about what happened to nurses who forgot their place. Hargrove didn't smile. That would have been unseemly. But he felt something move through his chest that might have been satisfaction, or might have been vindication, or might have been the simple pleasure of watching someone who had challenged him discover exactly what it cost to do so. The machinery was operational. The cascade had begun. And Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes, though he didn't know that title, would never know the weight it carried, the medals it represented, was about to learn that quiet competence was no match for institutional will. He picked up his phone and made one final call to the chief nursing officer, leaving a voicemail that was pure theater. Just want to make sure we're on the same page about this employee performance issue. I initiated a professional review, and I want to ensure we're following proper procedure. Just wanted you to know it's being handled appropriately. Talk soon. Proper procedure. The words would echo through every conference room by Monday afternoon. The siren started at 7:43 a.m. on a Monday that felt like every other Monday at Mercy General, fluorescent lights humming their eternal song, coffee going cold in paper cups, the usual rhythm of controlled chaos. Then the radio crackled, inbound, Trauma Bay 4. IED strike, multiple penetrating wounds, ETA for minutes. The charge nurse repeated it aloud, and something shifted. The word IED changed the temperature in the room like someone had opened a door to somewhere else entirely. The ambulance doors burst open and they wheeled him in on a stretcher moving faster than protocol usually allowed. Sergeant Major Marcus Webb, 28, face pale as drywall, his uniform soaked with blood that wasn't uniform anymore, just red, everywhere red. 7 wounds the paramedics had counted, chest, abdomen, both legs below the knee, and shrapnel embedded so close to his heart that the radiographer had held her breath studying the films. The attending trauma surgeon, Dr. Hargrove, materialized at the bay entrance like a predator scenting blood, his posture straightening, his voice already commanding the room before anyone had even transferred Webb to the hospital bed. Natalie moved into position on the left side, hands already reaching for the supplies she'd need, her fingers moving through their muscle memory routine without conscious thought. She had placed the first line, set the monitors, begun the initial assessment, vitals, pupils, capillary refill, when she saw it. The birthmark on Webb's neck. 6-shaped, positioned just below his left ear, the exact same configuration she'd seen on a 6-year-old boy's shoulder in 2004, in Kandahar province, in a moment that had never quite stopped being real despite 18 years of silence. This boy had been half buried in rubble from the school collapse on Dasht Barchi Road. She had carried him half a mile through active fire, his small weight against her chest, his heartbeat the only thing keeping her moving. His name was Marcus then, just Marcus, and he had cried for his mother in Dari and her arms had held him because her training said to hold them and her humanity said to never let go. Now he was bleeding out on her table again. Hargrove's voice cut through her recognition, get those pressures now. I want blood in the line, 2 units minimum. Someone get me an ultrasound, I want cardiac assessment immediately. The team moved with the precise chaos of a well-drilled machine, but Natalie felt Webb's vitals the way you feel gravity, present, immediate, undeniable. His blood pressure was dropping. 110, 95. 80. The monitor was speaking now in that language doctors learn to read fluently. The patient was crashing. She could hear it in the changing rhythm of the cardiac signal, see it in the way Webb's skin was taking on that waxy quality that meant his system was beginning to shut down from insufficient perfusion. Hargrove positioned himself at the ultrasound machine, his hands moving to the transducer with the assurance of someone who had done this 100 times before. But his hands were shaking. Not visibly to anyone else, Hargrove was too controlled, too practiced at appearing unshakable, but Natalie could see it. The tremor was small, barely perceptible, but it was there. He positioned the transducer on Webb's chest, his eyes fixed on the screen, and something in his expression froze. He began, and then stopped. Someone get me another stop. The orders were fragmenting, becoming unreliable, and the team sensed it the way animals sense an apex predator having second thoughts about the hunt. Webb's blood pressure was now 70/40 and dropping like he was hemorrhaging into his own chest cavity, which, Natalie realized, he was. The pericardial sac was filling with blood. Tamponade. The heart was being crushed by its own fluid like a fist slowly closing around a bird. The ultrasound would confirm it, but they didn't have time for confirmations. They had minutes. Maybe less. She looked at Hargrove's shaking hands, at his frozen posture, at the way he was staring at the screen as if it might change if he believed hard enough. She crossed the trauma bay in 4 strides. Her hand reached out and took the needle from Hargrove's grip without asking permission. The room went dead silent. "I'm sorry, doctor," she said, and her voice wasn't trembling, wasn't asking, wasn't apologetic despite the words. "But I'm not watching another one die." She turned toward Webb's bedside before Hargrove could respond, before security could be called, before the hierarchy could reassert itself through bureaucracy and fear. The procedure moved through her hands the way muscle memory moves through time. Below the xiphoid process, the bony landmark where ribs meet sternum, she positioned the needle. 45-degree angle toward the left shoulder. Steady advancement, feeling for the moment of resistance, for the subtle change in tension that meant the needle had breached the pericardial membrane. Then the syringe. Then the pull. Dark blood filled the chamber. 10 milliliters. 20. The monitor was still screaming, but differently now, urgently now, as if it sensed salvation approaching. 30 milliliters. She could feel the resistance decreasing as the pressure inside the sac diminished, as the crushing force on Webb's heart began to release. 40 milliliters. 50. 60. She withdrew the needle, pressure applied to the site, and before anyone could move or speak or restore the order that had fractured, Webb's blood pressure began climbing. 70. 85. 95. The cardiac monitor settled into something resembling a normal rhythm. The whisper of air moving through his lungs. The beeping of a heart that was returning to business as usual, to the simple work of keeping him alive. The room stayed silent except for the machines doing what machines do when they're given permission to work again. "You just committed career suicide," Hargrove said. His voice was low and steady again, which somehow made it worse. "That's practicing medicine without a license. You have no medical degree. You have no authorization." He turned to the charge nurse. "Document everything. Every action. Every moment. She's done." He didn't yell. He didn't need to. His words had the weight of institutions behind them, the backing of boards and licenses and systems designed to protect people like him from people like her. By Friday afternoon, Natalie stood in the HR office while a security guard held the door open. They handed her the cardboard box containing the fragments of her hospital life, a cracked mug that read "World's Okayest Nurse" with its handle glued on 3 different occasions. A dying succulent she'd neglected to water for the last 2 weeks because the days had stopped feeling separate from one another, just one long moment of walking through corridors and following orders and being invisible. A photograph of Lieutenant Sarah Chen, her platoon commander, KIA Helmand Province 2009, the woman who died covering Natalie's escape from an ambush that should have ended her instead. The walk through the lobby felt longer than it should have been. Every staff member who'd ever watched her refill coffee, clean up spills, answer questions without being asked, they all seemed to have gathered to witness. Hargrove stood on the second-floor walkway, arms crossed, watching with the satisfaction of a man who had neutralized a threat to the order he'd spent decades perfecting. The security guard didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence was the punctuation mark on her departure. The bus stop was 4 blocks away, on the corner of 5th and Mission, and the rain had started the way San Diego rain sometimes does in winter, tentative at first, then committed, then relentless. Natalie sat on the bench with the cardboard box on her lap, feeling the bottom beginning to soften as water seeped through the corrugated layers. The succulent tipped over inside. The mug shifted. She watched her reflection in a puddle at her feet and saw only what the hospital had confirmed, just a fired nurse. No one. Nothing. A woman who'd violated protocols and broken hierarchies and paid the price in the oldest currency of all, erasure. Her hands were still steady. That was the strange part. After everything, after the adrenaline had burned away and the consequences had arrived in a cardboard box, her hands were absolutely still. It wasn't composure anymore. Composure implies the possibility of breaking. This was something else. This was the calm that comes from having already survived the worst and finding that the worst has nothing left to teach you. The rain mixed with tears she hadn't intended to cry, and she let them come because no one was watching anymore. No one needed her to be strong. No one needed her to hide. She sat alone on a bench on a Friday that felt like it should have been a different day entirely, watching traffic blur through rain-streaked streetlights, waiting for a bus that would take her to an apartment that suddenly felt very far away and very empty. She had no way of knowing that by Monday morning, the sky would split open with the sound of helicopter rotors, and her entire second life would land on a parking lot of Mercy General like a judgment from heaven. The cardiac monitor flatlined at 11:44 a.m. on Friday, and by 2:15 p.m., Dr. Hargrove was making phone calls. His hands trembled as he dialed the first board member, not from shock, but from rage. The pericardiocentesis had worked. The blood pressure had climbed. Webb would live. And that fact burned through Hargrove's chest like acid because it meant Natalie Hayes had just proven what he'd spent 20 years hiding from: she was competent in ways his credentials could never touch. By Monday, she'd be gone. By Tuesday, she'd be erased. The board member picked up on the second ring. Dr. Hargrove, good timing, we have a critical issue. Hargrove cut him off, his voice steady now, controlled, the voice of a man in command. A floor nurse, Natalie Hayes, performed a physician-level procedure without authorization or proper medical credentials. Cardiac needle insertion. I stepped in to prevent further damage, but the hospital's exposure is significant. Liability-wise, we're looking at malpractice implications. The board member went quiet. Hargrove continued, I'm assembling documentation. The nursing academy needs to be contacted about her disciplinary history. I suspect there are gaps in her credentialing we should have caught years ago. Within an hour, Hargrove had activated all 3 board members, each phone call a small calculated bomb, each one phrased with just enough clinical concern to hide the vendetta. He wasn't ranting. He wasn't angry. He was a doctor protecting the hospital's reputation, and that made him dangerous in ways pure rage never could. The email came next. Hargrove's fingers moved across the keyboard with surgical precision, addressed to the San Diego Nursing Academy, marked urgent and confidential. I am writing to request a complete disciplinary file review for Natalie Hayes, RN, license number 8473992. During an emergency procedure today, she performed advanced interventions outside her scope of practice, suggesting possible gaps in her initial credentialing process. For patient safety purposes and institutional protection, we need verification of her educational background, any prior violations, and the circumstances of her licensure. This request is time-sensitive. He copied the hospital's legal department and hit send at 3:42 p.m. By 4:33 p.m., he had an outside investigator on retainer, a woman named Patricia Chen who specialized in personnel risk assessment. He met with her in his office, door closed, voice low. I need you to find anything irregular in her file. Employment gaps, financial issues, family problems, anything that suggests instability. She has access to patient medications and confidential records. I need documentation that we acted appropriately by terminating her employment. Chen took notes, nodded, and named her fee, $4,800. Hargrove wrote the check from his personal account. This had to stay invisible. Friday night, alone in his office with the lights dimmed, Hargrove reviewed his work. 3 board members contacted. The nursing academy mobilized. An investigator hunting through files. By Monday morning, the hospital would have no choice but to fire her. Not because she'd saved a life, but because the bureaucratic machinery would demand it. The beauty was in the system itself. He wasn't destroying her. The system was. He was simply pulling the levers that made the machine work. Security arrived for Natalie at 4:24 p.m. on Friday, just as the emergency department was shifting into the dinner hour lull. The guard was young, uncomfortable, holding a cardboard box like it might explode. "Miss Hayes? I'm going to need you to collect your personal items and your badge." The words were recited, not felt. Hospital protocol. The walk of shame was always the same, the sudden silence as colleagues glanced up then looked away, the fluorescent lights humming their indifferent song, the sound of shoes on tile echoing louder than any voice. Her locker opened to reveal exactly 21 years of a carefully constructed ordinary life. A coffee mug with a crack down the side that read "World's Okayest Nurse" in faded letters. A dying succulent she'd kept on the shelf for 3 years, refusing to throw it away even when it stopped flowering. And a photograph, her platoon commander, Captain David Chen, 2004, Helmand Province, taken 3 weeks before an IED took his legs and an infection took his life while she was holding his hand in a military hospital in Germany, the hand he'd used to sign her commendation recommendation. She placed each item in the box with the careful attention of someone handling sacred objects. The guard shifted his weight. Nobody spoke. She removed her employee badge, the laminated rectangle that had been her entire identity for 2 decades, and set it on top of the mug. The guard took it and turned it over in his hands like he wasn't sure what to do with it. The rain started as she walked out through the parking lot, the November sky splitting open as if San Diego was tired of pretending the weather was pleasant. Natalie stood at the bus stop on Meade Avenue, 15 minutes later, watching the cardboard box bottom begin to soften and collapse. The photo was already getting damp. The mug, at least, was waterproof. She stood there, soaked through her scrubs, watching her small quiet life literally dissolve into the gutter, water and cardboard mixing into pulp at her feet. 20 years. 20 years of silence, of keeping her head down, of letting Dr. Hargrove diminish her in staff meetings and hallways, and it had taken him less than 6 hours to erase it all. The bus pulled up at 5:14 p.m. She didn't get on. Monday morning broke grey and cold, and the sky above Mercy General split open with a sound that made every nurse in the ER freeze mid-task. WHUP, 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 WHUP. The MH-60S Navy transport helicopter descended through the rain like judgment descending from heaven, rotors churning the November air into submission, the rotor wash shaking windows and rattling equipment carts. The halo touched down on the parking lot with the precision of a bird landing on a branch, and the rotors continued their relentless percussion. A commander stepped out first, uniform pressed, insignia sharp in the rain. 2 armed sailors flanked him, both with the calm bearing of men who had crossed thresholds most people never approached. The commander walked through the emergency entrance, his boots echoing on tile that suddenly sounded very small, very civilian, very temporary. He approached the desk where the charge nurse sat, frozen in the moment between 2 breaths. "I'm looking for Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes. This is official U.S. Navy business." His voice was quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that makes rooms stop breathing. "She's a floor nurse here, or was employed here as of Friday. I need her name, service number confirmation, and current location." The charge nurse's hands moved in slow motion as she picked up the phone. Within 3 minutes, Natalie was called down from ICU. Within 5, she was standing in the emergency department in her civilian scrubs, watching a Navy commander hand her a sealed file marked official use only. The tab read her service number, 947-21-4847. In the trauma bay, Sergeant Major Marcus Webb lay awake in his hospital bed, chest bandaged, the pericardiocentesis scar visible beneath the dressing. His eyes tracked to the door as movement registered, and he saw her standing there in the hallway, the commander beside her, and something shifted in his face. Recognition. Understanding. He struggled to sit upright, ignoring the pain, and his voice came out rough and certain, "Senior Chief." The word hung in the air like a bell that had been rung. Natalie's hands remained steady as she opened the file. Mission orders. Humanitarian crisis in Yemen. Medical expertise required. Irreplaceable to national security. 6 months deployment. The words moved across her eyes but barely registered because Webb was staring at her as if seeing her for the first time, as if the nurse who'd cleaned his wounds and adjusted his fur had suddenly transformed into someone else entirely. The SEAL team leader stepped forward, a captain with the casual authority of someone who'd survived things most humans only read about. He spoke in the voice of someone reading a citation, and he spoke it loud enough for the entire emergency department to hear. Navy Cross for Valor in Kandahar during Operation Mountain Lion. 2 Bronze Stars with V device for combat medical excellence under fire. 2 Purple Hearts. Combat Medical Badge for Advanced Tactical Medicine. Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes, your service record is classified, but your competence is legendary. Medal by medal, the ER shifted. Nurses who had worked beside her for years stopped moving. Residents stared. The monitor above Webb's bed beeped its steady rhythm, the only sound in a room that had suddenly understood it had been harboring something extraordinary in plain sight. Dr. Hargrove appeared in the doorway then, drawn by the commotion, and his face moved through a progression of expressions, confusion, then comprehension, then a kind of slow-motion disintegration. The hospital administrator appeared beside him seconds later, face pale, holding a tablet. "My office," she said quietly to Hargrove. "Now." The security guard, the same one who had handed Natalie the cardboard box on Friday, approached Dr. Hargrove with the identical box, now empty, held with perfect professional courtesy. "Dr. Hargrove, I believe you know the way out." His voice was neither angry nor satisfied. It was simply the voice of someone doing what had to be done. "Your personal items are being collected. Your access badge is revoked effective immediately. You're to have no contact with staff or patients pending board review." Hargrove opened his mouth. Closed it. "You can't, my board connections." The administrator's voice cut through like a scalpel. "The board voted unanimously. The anonymous package that arrived this morning contained every email, every phone call, every fabricated complaint you filed about Ms. Hayes. We also have security footage of you blocking her access to the patient during the cardiac event. You prevented a qualified medical professional from saving that man's life. Pack your office. Now." Natalie turned back to the commander, her voice dropping to the controlled register of someone who had made this transition before. "When do we deploy?" The commander checked his watch. "Helicopter leaves in 40 minutes. Your gear is loaded. Welcome back to service, Senior Chief." She nodded once, the motion sharp as a salute. She looked at Webb, who was watching her with the expression of someone whose world had just realigned. "You're going to be fine, Sergeant Major. Listen to physical therapy. Your core stability is shot." He almost smiled, the expression of a man recognizing the drill sergeant beneath the nurse. She picked up the file and walked toward the exit, her gait changing almost imperceptibly, shoulders back, stride lengthening, the weight of command settling across her shoulders like a familiar coat. The mask had dropped completely now. The Senior Chief Petty Officer was no longer hidden. As she passed Hargrove in the hallway, she didn't glance at him. She didn't need to. She already knew what he was becoming, a man erased by his own calculations, a name being processed out of an institution, a footnote in another person's redemption story. The helicopter's rotors screamed as she crossed the parking lot, the rain beginning to ease, and she didn't look back at Mercy General. She was already thinking in the language of missions, coordinates, and survival. She was already home. Like this video if you support our troops. And if you or someone you love has served, Let us know in the comments, we'd be honored to hear from you. Subscribe and let's get back to the story.